My name is Eugene Worley, and along with my wife Glenda, we have spent nearly 50 years in ministry in Ethiopia, Norway, the UK, and in the US. I'd like in these podcasts to share with you some of our experiences from those years. Catching a ride. From the time Philip hitched a ride with an Ethiopian eunuch in the Gaza desert, God has used a variety of ways to bring Ethiopians to Christ. When we left Ethiopia in 1971, one of the men from Boli Baptist Church worked at the airport. In fact, he went on the plane to tell us goodbye. I told him that if we never saw him again, that we would see him in heaven. He went home and told his family what I told him. His 12-year-old son, Berhanu, heard what he said and realized that heaven was real, and he wanted to go there too. He came to Christ and later became pastor of this church. This was all unknown to me until 1994, when he spoke at an international missions conference. He told the story while I was sitting in the congregation, and then he asked me to stand up. I never dreamed that in 4 years I would work with this same pastor as a partner in the ministry. Only heaven will tell the real story. Ethiopia is a very large country, nearly twice the size of Texas. It is now the second most populous country in Africa, with over 80 different tribal groups. It is a huge challenge to get the gospel into the various areas of the country. This was certainly my burden, and one that Pastor Berhanu had as well. As I mentioned in previous podcasts, that the churches during the famine had often worked with the international aid organizations to help people. It was through this means that Boli Baptist had reached out to various towns outside of Addis Ababa, and while helping to distribute aid, had also taken the opportunity to preach the gospel. In one of the training programs that Boli Baptist sponsored for those evangelists serving outside of Addis Ababa, there were two who had come to Christ from Islam. One of these had been saved through the testimony of a relative who'd gone to Addis and was saved through the ministry of Boli Baptist Church. When he was married, he invited the Boli church family to go with him back to his home country for the wedding. They sang hymns and gospel songs and preached the gospel. People were saved, and among them was another young man who came to Addis for the training program. The other evangelist was converted from Islam and was the first in his area to embrace Christianity. He was so committed that he gave some of his land on which to build a church. Later, we made a trip down to this area for a baptismal service. There were 19 converted Muslims who were baptized. This trip was not without incident, however. On the way down to this area, I hit a donkey that damaged the left signal light and the left fender. Fortunately, the donkey was not hurt, and we did not have the inevitable haggling with the owner and the police over damages. However, I did have to get my truck worked on, and I had another trip planned for the next weekend in a totally different area. Due to the damage done on the truck, I had to drive my little Daewoo Domus van, which is a small Korean vehicle that small businesses often used around Addis. We made the trip fine and had a great service with a small mission church. However, after the services, we went to a restaurant to eat, and when we got ready to leave, I was backing up to make room to turn around. My van was loaded with passengers, plus it was raining, and without realizing it, I backed into a low overhanging branch of a tree. It crashed the rear window and bent the rear door to my little van. We managed to get some plastic to cover the back window and made it back for the 3-hour drive. Before I could get the repairs done, I had to convince the police in Addis that I had not been involved with hitting a person. Pastor Berhanu had spoken to me about a people in southwest Ethiopia near the Kenyan-Sudan border that desperately needed the gospel. So we decided to make a survey trip to that area. There were several tribes in that area which did not have a gospel witness. We felt it was best for us to go and see for ourselves whether this was an open door for the church. It was a 2-day journey by vehicle, and since an accident was blocking a bridge, we decided to fly rather than drive. We would have to fly into Jinka, where there were only 2 flights per week, so there was a small window of time to do what we needed to do. The plan was to fly in on a Thursday and return on Saturday. Unfortunately, our flight was delayed 1.5 hours from Addis, and when we arrived at Jinka, it was clouded over and we could not land, but had to land at another place and refuel. We finally arrived at Jinka at 3 p.m., which meant that we could not do anything that day. The next morning, we managed to get a 4-wheel drive pickup and drove 4 hours on rough and bumpy roads to the south of Jinka. We were able to see many of the tribal people along the way and finally arrived at a small village where the Hammer people lived. They're a peaceful people who have retained a way of life that goes back hundreds of years. They wear very little clothing, and they're animistic in their worship. They believe that 2 stars came together to create the world. At that time, their language had not been developed into writing. It gave us a burden to reach these people with the gospel. We returned to Jinka and realized someone would have to go and live with these people, learn their language and their culture. In other words, be a missionary to them. One of the positive results of that trip was meeting an Ethiopian evangelist who had gone to the area to do exactly that. God used it to convince Pastor Berhanu that it would be possible for someone from his own church to go and work with these people. The writer of Proverbs says, "Without a vision, people perish." This certainly gave both of us a vision for getting the gospel to the people groups of southwestern Ethiopia. On Saturday morning, we went to the airstrip, which actually came into the middle of the town, and prepared to leave. Though we had returned tickets, we had failed to confirm our return flight when we arrived on Thursday. They would have had the 2 seats for us, but they had an extra crew member on this flight, so there was only 1 seat available. The plane was a 17-seater, and they would only allow me to take the flight back to Addis. Berhanu was very brave and accepted this situation without complaining. He negotiated with a truck driver who was hauling coffee beans to take him as far as the bridge that was blocked. There he crossed by foot and managed to get a ride on another truck. It took him 24 hours of very hard travel before he arrived in Addis on Monday night. He told me later that he was convinced the Lord allowed this to happen so he could see the harvest fields of the country. As a reminder of how blessed we are in the Western world, I gave this challenge to our churches in a newsletter in 2001. If you woke up this morning with more health than illness, then you're more blessed than the millions who will not survive the week. If you have never experienced the danger of battle, the loneliness of imprisonment, or the pangs of starvation, then you're ahead of 500 million people in the world. If you can attend a church meeting without fear of harassment, arrest, torture, or death, then you are more blessed than 3 billion people in the world. If you have food in the refrigerator, clothes on your back, and a roof over your head, you're richer than 75% of this world. If you have money in the bank, in your wallet, and spare change in a dish someplace, you are among the top 8% of the world's wealthy. In closing, would you pause and pray that the Lord would call more workers for these needy places? This is podcast number 25, and I look forward to sharing more stories about the work in Ethiopia in our next podcast.